everyone. Welcome back inside the UC Health Training Center for another episode of Broncos Now. Team reporter and host Sydney Jones here. And coming up on today's episode, we'll take a look at the Broncos head coaching search, what the latest reports are, and who has reportedly emerged as the Broncos' top candidate. All that and more coming up. Joining me here inside the Broncos podcast studio to take a closer look at the head coaching search news is Broncos lead writer Aric DiLalla. Aric, the waiting game continues.
Yeah, more waiting. It's been It's been a quiet week. Some reports still kind of swirling around, but Sid, I think by this point, a lot of people expected the Broncos to be doing second interviews, to have people in the building, and it's really been kind of quiet until Thursday when 9 News' Mike Kliss put out a report that Demico Ryans is among the top candidates for the job. And really, that's the first thing we've heard since the first round of interviews ended last week. Yeah, it has been pretty quiet around here, Aric. You mentioned Mike Kliss saying that Demico Ryans has been one of the top candidates, or is emerging as one of the top candidates. So what do you like about him, and what do you think he'll add if he is the hire here? Yeah, I mean, it's Demico, I think, is not a guy that necessarily at the start of this search you would have expected to be at the top of the list, just because I think the Broncos were clear that while it wasn't, a deal breaker, they were looking for somebody with head coaching experience. And so, the names that came out right away were the Sean Paytons, Dan Quinn, Frank Reich, who, of course, just got hired by Carolina, the first domino to fall there in the coaching searches around the league. Jim Harbaugh, of course, was mentioned from Michigan. So you looked at all these guys and you thought, okay, well, maybe one of these guys would have to really wow you in terms of an interview and their on-field performance. And, it seems like that must have been what Demico Ryans did to be considered, reportedly one of these top candidates. The 49ers do have the best scoring defense in the NFL. He's had a short tenure there. I believe this is just his second season, but obviously in his second consecutive NFC championship, worked with inside linebackers. Fred Warner, obviously a really, really good player. And I think Demico Ryans himself, an inside linebacker, you see the mentality on that defense. They're physical, they're fast, they hit you hard. And, when you're looking at a head coach, and especially this Broncos team that I think could probably stand to be a little more disciplined, accountable, tougher, those are the traits that you see in this defense that I think could come to this Denver team. And so those things all stand out about Demico Ryans kind of when you first look at him. And yes, he would be the fourth consecutive first-time head coach for this organization. But I think if you see enough in him to decide, hey, he's the best coach no matter what his experience is, then maybe it makes sense. Right.
I know Kyle Shanahan, he came out this week and said, he had some high praise for Demico Ryans, gave him some strong endorsements, said that, last year he thought he was really ready to be a head coach. So, he more than deserves it this year.
Yeah, absolutely. He's a guy that is, you hear people talk about who are the best up-and-coming coaches, right. And Demico Ryans has been on that list for a long time. I believe he just was named some organization handed him assistant coach of the year.
Right, yeah.
So clearly he's up there with the best of them. You'd be hiring another defensive guru. He went from defensive with Vic Fangio to offensive with Nathaniel Hackett. So this would be a swing back in the defensive direction, but it's less to me about that. It's more about someone who can lead the entire football team. And it sounds like from the people around him that he would be that type of guy.
Sure. And you mentioned a little bit earlier, Frank Reich, he was the first to go in this head coaching cycle. I feel like this year things have been a little bit slow in this cycle.
Yeah,
what do you think that is?
It's interesting. I think technically it's about the same. The Broncos announced and the Bears announced their two head coaches last year on January 27th. So we're still about the same time frame. But I think
slower.
I think maybe the fact that Nathaniel Hackett was dismissed before the season ended,
right?
The coaching search and all the speculation started then. So I think maybe it just feels like a couple weeks longer. And then the fact that there hasn't been a lot of action this week, at least from an outside perspective, it does seem like maybe it's gone a little bit long, but we'll see. A decision could come, I'd imagine, at any moment. You'd think because the Broncos aren't, or at least from an external standpoint, from what we know, they're not doing second-round interviews. Yeah. I would imagine they're getting close to at least, targeting somebody. Mm-hmm. And so you would think in the coming days that it's possible you hear an announcement. And again, we're just kind of all guessing at this point because you don't really know what's going on with the search committee. But I would just say to people, be patient. The Broncos are doing their best, I'm sure, to find the right head coach, no matter how long it takes. And I do imagine that this Frank Reich hiring will start to get things going a little bit because a team like Arizona, who was considering Frank Reich, well, now they've got to move on to somebody else. Yeah. And, Houston has to start getting things going. Indianapolis is probably trying to figure out who do they want. So you've got 4 teams left now looking to hire coaches, and I would imagine things will get going pretty quickly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, among some of the other candidates that have been reported, there's Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn, former Stanford head coach David Shaw, former Lions and Colts head coach Jim Caldwell, and of course Sean Payton. Aric, just to start looking at Sean Payton, it's kind of been reported that his candidacy seems to be, losing a bit of steam here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think everybody first assumed, hey, it's going to be Jim Harbaugh, and then everybody assumed after that, okay, it's going to be Sean Payton. And they're, part of it is the draft compensation, of course. I think you've got to decide if you're the Broncos, is it worth it? To give up a first-round pick has been floated around a lot. Is it worth it to give that up to get a coach, or can you find a coach that brings the same value without losing that draft capital, or maybe better value? And again, we don't know that Sean Payton is out of it by any means, but you're right. There are a lot of reports last week that said, hey, he's the front runner. He's in position to be hired. You don't know where that's coming from. I mean, it does seem like the Broncos themselves have been pretty tight-lipped, and not a lot has come out of the organization, has come out of UCL training center. So then you start to wonder, okay, well, where is this coming from? Some more reports this week that say, maybe Sean Payton was worried about ownership. It just kind of conflicts with what was said last week by some of the same reporters that Sean Payton's really excited about the ownership group. So you wonder kind of what happened there. But you're right. It does seem like maybe that's lost a little bit of steam. Doesn't mean it couldn't change, but kind of in this day-to-day cycle that we're in, it does seem, there were reports that he was going to be here for an interview, and then there were reports that changed, and it never got scheduled. So there was an errant report about hunting. I mean, there's been all sorts of stuff that has gone on, and I think that's probably, there's been all this silence, and there's been this void. People are just trying to figure things out. They're trying to, throw stuff around and see what sticks. So I think right now you've got to tune a lot of that out and just trust the process, kind of as cliche as that sounds.
Definitely. Well, 2 other guys I want to look at here is Dan Quinn and Jim Caldwell. Both are reported to be also strong candidates for the position. What do you like about those 2, and what do you think they'll add here?
Yeah, I mean, both former head coaches, so they add that experience. And again, I think that in a perfect world, someone having that experience is helpful. Dan Quinn took a team to the Super Bowl, 2 playoff appearances. Obviously, he worked with Kyle Shanahan, and that's what got that team to the Super Bowl. Didn't go quite as well after Kyle left, but I do believe they made a playoff appearance without Kyle. So still possible to have success. He's a player-friendly coach. Guys love him. Has a really good defense right now in Dallas. He would be a really strong hire, I think, and a really good option. And the same with Jim Caldwell, who has been the head coach of a pair of teams, really respected guy in this league, led the Colts to a Super Bowl appearance. Really did well with Detroit and was actually fired after a 9-win season, which kind of in retrospect with what they've gone through the last few years, you wonder, well, why was he ever let go? He's been out of it a little bit, just in terms of the coaching world. I believe he had 1 season where he was an assistant in the league. But since his last year, I believe 2017, he's just had that 1 year. And so you wonder, well, is he going to want to jump back in full time after this half decade? Or what's his ideal plan there? So 2 other strong candidates, though, both with coaching experience. And Cindy, right now, it's hard to rule anything out until we know for sure. And because we don't have, if we had second-round interviews and you could say, okay, well, these 3 guys are interviewing for the second time, these are the 3 finalists.
Right.
We have no idea who's a finalist. I mean, it's all kind of speculation, media reports at this point. We're all just trying to make our best guess.
Well, hopefully we'll know sooner than later.
I hope so.
Aric, just a couple more here for you. Whoever it is that ownership does hire, what do you think the next head coach's, I guess, first order of business should really be when they get here?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to start with the staff, right? Yeah. I think the importance of putting together a really good staff was underlined, emphasized. It was clear this year because I do think Nathaniel Hackett put together a staff that, especially on the offensive side of the ball, at the beginning, it changed a little bit when you brought Jerry Rosberg in to help manage the clock. But at the beginning, it was very inexperienced staff. And not to say there weren't guys with NFL experience. We had a first-time offensive coordinator in Justin Outten, and a first-time head coach in Nathaniel Hackett. And so I think experience on the coaching staff is important. Yeah. Now, that depends. If you hire a guy like Sean Payton or Dan Quinn, maybe it's less important and you want, or Jim Caldwell, maybe it's less important and you want to bring in some young guys around to kind of bring the energy up. If it's a Demico Ryans, like Mike Kliss is reporting could potentially happen as one of the favorites, right. I do think that experience would be important. And especially if it's a defensive-minded guy like a Quinn, a Demico Ryans, right. The offensive coordinator is critically important because, you're not going to – those guys are not going to be, I don't think, intimately involved in the offensive scheme and the play calling, obviously. So they'll help with the fourth down decisions, I would imagine, but they're not – determining the scheme. And so you've got to find somebody there that works. And it's not always easy to put together a staff. I mean, last year we saw Nathaniel Hackett. I think he had ideas of who he wanted. There were reports that Adam Stenavich in Green Bay, Luke Getsy, that he wanted those guys as his OC. It didn't work out that way. Right. And so it's a difficult process. I would think that if it is a first-time head coach like a Demico Ryans, George Payton would be there to provide support, maybe Greg Penner as well. Right. If it is a more experienced coach like a Dan Quinn, a Jim Caldwell, a Sean Payton, they probably know what they're doing a little bit more. But yeah, the staff is the first thing you got to figure out. And, Sid, we talk about, hey, when is this going to happen? An advantage to getting it done sooner rather than later is you can get that staff going because you don't want to be available. Yeah, you don't want to be the last team to put that staff together from a position group standpoint. And then also you look around the league, I think at one point there were 9 to 10 teams that were looking for new offensive coordinators, a similar number looking for new defensive coordinators. You want the best at that spot. At whatever scheme you decide you want to run, you want the best at that spot. And so the longer you wait, you worry, is this guy going to get, snapped up by this team? And so it'll be crucial that as soon as the new head coach is in place, they start working on that staff.
Outside of, putting the staff together, what do you think's next on the list? Maybe getting that relationship going with Russell Wilson?
Yeah, that's a good point. There's certain rules, I think, about what you can talk about in terms of football versus non-football, right. But obviously non-football stuff is good. And, have these conversations, get to know Russell, certainly diving into the film and seeing what he did well over those last 2 weeks earlier in the season. What can we do to replicate that, to see more of the old Russell Wilson, quote unquote. And I think just connecting with all the players and setting an understanding of this is what the culture is going to be. And it doesn't matter what it was like a year ago or 2 years ago or guys like Justin Simmons who have been here for a long time and seen this will be his 5th different head coach. I mean, you've got to set an understanding. This is going to be different. This is how we're going to do things here. This is going to be the culture of accountability, of discipline. And in my mind, you can say that starts team meeting number 1 in April or whenever the guys come back. But I think you've got to set that with the staff, how you interact in the building with people, how you challenge the people around you to work, to scout guys for free agency, for the draft. I mean, I would imagine that, depending on who the coach is, it'll change, I would imagine, their involvement in terms of the final roster, say. But they're going to be involved in some way. And so it's important to start getting that culture set immediately so that by the time the guys get here in April, you can tell, hey, it's different around here. And, there are things that I really enjoyed about Nathaniel Hackett, but I think it's clear things need to be different from the way they were the last several years. And so whoever you bring in, you got to get started on that right away.
I agree. Yeah. I like that. Build the culture from the get-go.
Yep.
All right. Well, we'll keep on waiting and see what happens. Hopefully we'll know something sooner than later, but appreciate your time always, Aric.
You got it, Sid.
Well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Broncos Now, Broncos Country. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure to follow the Broncos Podcast Network on Twitter and the Denver Broncos YouTube to stay up to date on all the latest episodes. I will see you right back here next week for another one.